50,000 children, U.S. citizens, natural born, whose parents have TPS, temporary protected status. What's going to happen to those children if the parents get deported back to Haiti?
That's the big question that no one can give you a good answer for.
Are you concerned about the growing influence of political extremism, hyperpolarization, and misinformation? Well, you're not alone. This is the American Values Coalition podcast, where we explore the root causes of these societal ills and provide you with strategies to counter them. Refugees. Why should Christians and churches support refugees? And what is the current state of refugee policy in the U.S.? That's the topic for today. My guest to talk about this is Matthew Sorens. He's Vice President of Advocacy and Policy at World Relief, and he is the author of the newest edition of Seeking Refuge, The Human Face of the Global Refugee Crisis. Matthew Sorens, welcome to the ABC podcast.
Yeah, always good to be with you, Nap.
So give us a little backstory. So the first edition came out in like a decade ago, right? So what was the original idea behind publishing this book, and then why the new edition?
Yeah, I mean, the original idea behind this book in 2016 was the world was facing, at the time, an unprecedented global refugee crisis. In fact, we opened the first edition of that book with this startling number that there was 60 million people around the world who'd been forcibly displaced from their homes, and that was an unprecedented number. Never before in recorded history have there been that many people forced to flee their homes, and many of them displaced within their countries, but also many who'd gone outside of their countries as refugees. And the main thesis of the book, which is still the main thesis of the book, is this is a crisis that needs the response of the global church. And the American church, frankly, should be on the forefront of responding to this crisis. The reason for a second edition was 10 years later. We started a decade ago with that figure of 60 million people forcibly displaced. 10 years later, the number is roughly doubled. There are nearly 120 million people around the world who've been forcibly displaced. So in just 10 years, we went from a record high and then doubled it. And I think the argument that we would make that the church should be on the forefront of this crisis is more urgent than ever, but honestly it comes at a time when we have seen some churches stepping into that in really beautiful ways, and we try to tell some of that story in the book. But we've also seen this issue of refugee resettlement, in the U.S. context in particular, become much more politically volatile, and to the point that, as we're recording this, the refugee resettlement program has been suspended. There's been a very narrow exception only made for one category of people who don't actually meet the international legal definition of a refugee, and that they're not being selected after having fled their country because of a well-founded fear of persecution. And I think there's a lot of American Christians who are concerned about that, but if there's not so much political concern that it is making it politically impossible to have that policy. And so the U.S. is doing far less than ever, and if we hoped that other countries would step into that gap, we are not generally seeing that. We're instead seeing other countries sort of following the U.S.'s lead in most cases, at a time that the scale of the refugee crisis globally, the people being forced to flee their homes, including for reasons like their faith in Jesus, is greater than ever before.
But besides the new data, is there anything else new in the new edition?
Yeah, it's actually pretty thoroughly rewritten. So, we actually gave the book a new subtitle, The Human Face of the Global Refugee Crisis. We wanted to really double down on telling stories. So most of the stories in the book are actually new. A few are updated from the first edition, but most of them are new stories, really reflecting the current dynamics of the refugee crisis. So, a decade ago, we focused a lot on the Syrian refugee crisis, and there is still a Syrian refugee crisis, tragically 10 years later. But I think the dynamics that are more recently in people's minds right now would be Ukraine, Afghanistan, even the crisis in Sudan. I don't know if that's on people's mind, but that is actually the top country producing displacement right now, even if people are not necessarily paying attention in the United States. So we wanted to tell some new stories, and then of course updating, responding to some of the concerns that have created the current political dynamic that makes refugee resettlement so difficult. So what about the economics of this? What about safety and security, vetting, helping people? We are concerned at World Relief in general about immigrants who are vulnerable for any number of reasons, but I think a lot of the issues around the border and questions of what about someone who's unlawfully in the country have gotten conflated in some pretty unhelpful ways with the refugee resettlement process, which is people who are identified by the U.S. government overseas, vetted overseas, and who come to the United States on airplanes at the invitation of the U.S. government. So it's really a separate conversation from what about the border or what about someone who's overstayed a visa.
Yeah, and we even separate those, right? So one is like the State Department. So the State Department deals with refugees, and DHS with immigration. Did I get that right?
I mean, historically both the State Department and DHS have roles in the refugee process. So DHS is involved in vetting, but yeah, historically it has been a State Department program. And I think that speaks to the reality that refugee resettlement has historically been seen as a part of U.S. foreign policy. It's a way that the U.S. Lives out its values among other nations. And, historically, for example, if you look at like the Reagan administration or the first Bush administration, it was a time when we were standing against communism. And part of the way we did that was we offered refuge to people fleeing from the Soviet Union, whether for political reasons or religious reasons, or from Cuba, for example. We've received a lot of people with refugee status from Cuba over the years. Likewise, when we say that we stand for international religious freedom, which I think rightly almost every U.S. administration says, we have historically welcomed people fleeing persecution on account of their faith through the Refugee Resettlement Program. So, for example, one of the stats we share in the book, in 2024, there was about 100,000 refugees resettled to the United States, and most of them were Christians. In fact, most of those Christians, about 30,000 overall, were from the 50 countries where Open Doors US says that Christians face the most severe persecution in the world. So there's a pretty good reason to presume that religion is, if at least one, if not the primary reason that these individuals, these refugees, faced persecution in their country of origin. And I think the sad reality is that door of refuge for people who fled religious persecution has almost entirely closed. This year, in 2026, based on current projections, we're not done with the year yet, but based on the announced policies of the current administration, we expect 0 Christian refugees to be resettled from the 50 countries on the Open Doors World Watch List for Christian persecution. So that opportunity to offer refuge to people who fled religious persecution, whether as Christians or also, of course, in other religious minority contexts, but particularly as Christians, has been closed basically entirely at this point.
So what is the biblical case for welcoming refugees? And given that everyone these days, we all have short attention spans, give us the elevator pitch, the biblical case for welcoming refugees.
Yeah, I think the challenge is that there's so much more than an elevator's worth of biblical content, but to the extent that that's sometimes our limitation, first and foremost, God cares for those who are vulnerable. And in the Old Testament, the 3 groups that get mentioned repeatedly are the orphan, the widow, and the foreigner. And refugees often fit into more than one of those categories, but certainly are foreigners. There's also just the biblical idea of hospitality. And hospitality is more than having your friends over for a meal or, cleaning up the guest room for your in-laws. In fact, arguably, those don't meet the definition of biblical hospitality, which in the Greek of the New Testament is philoxenia. It is the love of strangers. But we are commanded to practice hospitality in Romans 12. In Hebrews 13, we're told that some people, by entertaining strangers, have entertained angels without realizing it. And then I would say sort of the 2 other factors biblically. One would be the Great Commission, that we have this command from Jesus to go and make disciples of all nations, and we certainly can and should do that by sending missionaries around the world. But we are missing something really profound if we don't notice that God in his sovereignty has also sent the nations to a country like the United States. And that both includes people who would probably have never encountered the story of Jesus in their country of origin, because many of these are contexts where it's illegal to share the gospel, it's illegal to receive it. And people land in this context where they are free to receive it. And again, we value religious freedom at World Relief. We're not pressing this on anyone or coercing anyone. We're sharing our Christian faith. But this is a context where, as we connect people to volunteers from local church, they are free to share their faith, and those other people are free to receive it or to reject it, which is a different context than in so many other parts of the world. But I think that's actually an incredible opportunity for the American church. And then the flip side of that is sometimes people think, well, this is a mission on our doorsteps, and it often is. But actually, most of the refugees resettled in recent years have already been Christians. And many of them are actually Christians who, their reason for being a refugee, as I said, was their Christian faith. And those individuals often bring a very vibrant Christian faith with them to a context in the United States where we could use a little bit of extra vibrancy. We have people who have a commitment to evangelism, to sharing the hope of the gospel, to transforming society, rooted in their biblical values, that I think is a huge blessing to the United States. So I think that standing with the persecuted church is, maybe half of that, and then seeing a Great Commission opportunity is the other half of that.
Yes, amen to a more vibrant faith. So we'd mentioned, like, in terms of public policy, we have refugee policy, and we have immigration policy. When you're looking at it from a biblical perspective, are those two separate as well, or how would you think about it from a biblical perspective?
Yeah, I mean, biblically, I wouldn't say they're separate in that, of course, the U.S. doesn't give you a U.S. refugee policy or a U.S. immigration policy. And generally speaking, I think the way that the U.S. government responds to refugees as sort of a subset of immigrants, there are good reasons that historically U.S. law has had some special considerations for refugees, who, again, by definition, are people who have fled their country because of a well-founded fear of persecution. I would not want to claim that the Bible says this is how many refugees should come, or this is how refugees should be treated in relation to those who come with an employer sponsor or those who have a family relationship. But I do think there is, I think if there's a biblical principle that does speak to this, one of them would be that idea that to whom much is given, much is required. And the U.S. has been blessed in many, many ways as a nation. And I think that would give us a compelling reason to offer refuge, at least, not without limit. No one is saying the U.S. must take in all the people fleeing persecution in the world, those roughly now 40 million refugees around the world, or 120 million people who've been forcibly displaced. But we clearly could take 100,000 refugees per year. We did so as recently as 2 years ago, and most economists would tell you it was not just charitable for us to do so. It was in our own economic interest. It was people who filled key needs in the labor market of the United States. It again brought some vibrancy to the church that we value. It created opportunities for the church in other ways. So I don't want to overstate the biblical case in the terms of the specifics of policy, but I do think that there's a good biblical rationale for having a priority for people who would come as immigrants who specifically have fled persecution. And for example, Christians have a strong stake in standing with the persecuted church, and one way that we would do so is by insisting that our refugee resettlement program offer refuge to people who have fled religious persecution.
Yeah, you make a good point about how globally, it's an issue. Sometimes when I bring up the refugee issue, the response I'll hear is like, oh, but we can't take in every refugee around the world. And that's not what we're asking either. I mean, talk about, like, what are ways that, like, churches we can talk about in terms of churches or in terms of American public policy, how we can support refugees that are not coming to us but are going to other places around the world.
Yeah, I do think it's really important to know, like I just mentioned the figure of 100,000 refugees being resettled in 2024. I think that would be we would be thrilled, frankly, if we would get back to that level, because at this point we're nowhere near that. That was 1/4% of the world's refugees in 2024. Nobody was talking about, should we take half of the world's refugees or a quarter of the world's refugees or even 1%. Nobody, that wasn't really on the policy agenda. But by the U.S. taking a relatively small share of the most vulnerable refugees, it basically it certainly makes a difference to those 100,000 people, and it also lets the U.S. To some extent have some diplomatic leverage with our allies to say they need to do their share as well. And some of those are allies who are not wealthy countries. I mean, many of the world's refugees are living in a country neighboring the country that they fled in that are among some of the poorest countries in the world. I mean, for example, you have refugees from Sudan, who are living in South Sudan, which is actually, I think, by many measures, the poorest country in the world. Others are living in Chad. And to that question of what can the church do there, that's one thing I love about World Relief. Our mission is to boldly engage the world's greatest crises in partnership with the church. And we do that both by resettling refugees in the United States, a small share of the world's refugees, and working with churches to do that. But also we're on the ground in Chad. We're on the ground in South Sudan. We're caring for people who've been forced to flee across the border and the people who've been internally displaced. And we're on the ground in Sudan as well. And churches can come alongside organizations like World Relief and in many cases local churches in those places to care for the much larger issue of displacement and to address some of the dynamics that fueled displacement in the first place. I mean, our preference, of course, would be that people don't have to leave their homes. When they do, we think it's important that the church offer welcome and hospitality. But anything that the church can do, and what the church can do in terms of influencing government as well, to make it possible to survive and ideally even flourish in the midst of these very fragile contexts around the world. Places like Sudan, South Sudan, the Democratic Republic of Congo, places like Ukraine right now, which obviously is beset by war, places like Venezuela, where they were already facing an incredible humanitarian crisis, and then they got hit by multiple earthquakes that have just exacerbated that crisis many times over. Places like Haiti, which the U.S. government has recognized as being in a state of emergency for several years now. Again, layers of natural disaster and political crisis and gang violence that all sort of layer on top of each other. So World Relief at the moment is either directly or working with partners in each of those places. And I think that sometimes we get the question, well, should we address the refugee crisis over there or should we address it here? And our answer to that would be yes. I mean, that's a false dichotomy, because God has made his church to be very large and global and in all of these places. And we think it's important that we're responding on both sides of that discussion.
I think so. What I'm hearing is it's really about your mindset as a Christian, that you're not part of the American church. You're part of the church global, right? And as part of this global entity, even through your denominations and through other networks, you have all these connections to other churches all around the world. And what a blessed position to be in, where we can use, as Christians in America, we can use these global networks that we have to help people around the world. And like you said, it doesn't always mean refugees coming here, but although sometimes that's it. But it's also how we can help all these refugees around the world just through the networks that we have.
Yeah, and that's why it's really the central thesis of this book, Seeking Refuge, is that this is a moment for the church. I mean, for the church in the United States, which uniquely has a lot of resources, and we're thankful for that if we're willing to be good stewards of them. But for the church in Europe, and the church in Latin America, and the church in Africa, and the church in the Middle East, like in Asia, all these places, God has established his church, and it is, we believe, God's solution to these crises. Of course, working together with governmental partners, working with other parts of society, and then just getting, we talk about the church, and we really believe in that as a single entity. We believe in there's one body with many parts. But getting the church across different congregations, sometimes across some theological differences, to work together is also obviously a challenge in our context in the United States and in other parts of the world as well. But it's something we're really committed to at World Relief. How do we help the church work in unity to address some of these great crises that are besetting our world?
So let's turn now to some current events. So we are recording this now on July 22nd, 2026. By the time you're listening to this, some of what we're going to talk about may have changed somewhat in terms of policy, but their TPS, temporary protected status, is in the news. Give us what is that all about, and what's the latest?
Yeah, so temporary protected status, I think importantly, as we're talking about refugees, it is similar to refugees in that it is people who fled a bad circumstance, but it is distinct in that it is not refugee status. If you were resettled to the United States, is a permanent legal status. It has no expiration on it. Temporary protective status, as the name implies, is temporary. It has an expiration date. Now, historically, those expiration dates have often been renewed, and that's possible under the law. Usually every 18 months, the Secretary of Homeland Security addresses the particular country of origin for which temporary protected status was granted, and this goes back to a law that was signed by President Bush back in 1990. And basically, the Secretary of Homeland Security will say, are the conditions in that country such that we should continue to allow these people to remain lawfully in temporary capacity and continue to work lawfully in the United States? Or is it sufficiently safe, the underlying conditions that maybe justify this granting of temporary protected status initially are such that we can send people back? And the Trump administration has terminated temporary protected status for one country after another, including countries where we think there's a very compelling case to be made, even just reading from the State Department reports about these countries, that they should really be extended. So countries like Afghanistan, Venezuela, and then Syria, and then probably most urgently and recently Haiti. So the administration announced in the last year that they intended to terminate temporary protected status for Haiti. Haiti's also just relevant because there's a lot of people who this affects. There's 330,000 Haitians, as we're recording this, still lawfully present in the United States. And again, it will be within the coming days. We expect that they will now lose their temporary protected status, and that's a result of the administration making that determination. The former Secretary of Homeland Security, Christine Holmes, said basically it's safe enough for them to go back. It's not safe, according to the State Department, for U.S. citizens to go to Haiti. which also, by the way, would include about 50,000 U.S. citizen minor children who have a parent who is here lawfully with temporary protected status. But the administration is taking the position it's safe enough to send Haitians back. And the Supreme Court, basically, this was challenged in court. That's why it took a little bit of a while for a final decision. But in late June, the Supreme Court ruled that not that it's fine to send Haitians back. They're not really addressing that question. But their decision was that the administration actually has the authority to make this determination, and they don't really have the authority to second guess that. And I'm sympathetic, actually, to the challenge in front of the court there, because on the one hand, you have very specific rules for how this determination is to be made, including consulting with the State Department, and there's really good evidence that the Department of Homeland Security did not do that. On the other hand, in the statute, it also says that the decision is not reviewable by the courts. So the Supreme Court is sort of weighing on the part of that said we don't actually have the authority to review this decision, which also begs the question, is there any sort of accountability to actually following the rules? Because it's pretty clear that at least the former Secretary of Homeland Security didn't follow the rules. I would say where we're at with this now is sort of the last hope, barring a total change of opinion on the part of the Trump administration, would be for Congress to step in. And perhaps somewhat surprisingly, the House of Representatives did so. They actually passed a bill with bipartisan support a few weeks back that would simply extend temporary protected status for Haitians, those who currently have temporary protected status, allow them to continue to work lawfully, continue to be lawfully present with their U.S. citizen children, continue to be part of their local churches. The Haitian community is largely Christian. That bill, though, of course, would have to pass the U.S. Senate. So that's something we've been very actively advocating for, World Relief. And I would say we've seen a lot of evangelical Christians join in that advocacy as well. People, I think, including yourself, Knapp, have signed on to a letter urging the Congress to take up legislation to allow Haitians to stay lawfully in the United States. We saw leads of at least 10 different evangelical denominations sign on to that letter. Lots, Walter Kim with the National Association of Evangelicals. So a pretty broad range of both theologically and ethnically and geographically evangelical Christians throughout the United States speaking into that situation. But whether the Senate will actually act on it, I think probably depends on how much in the midst of a midterm election year they feel that this is important to their constituents, which is why we've really been asking people to make phone calls to encourage their senators to pass this sort of legislation. Which, by the way, we're coming at this from a Christian perspective, from a kind of humanitarian perspective. There's also a lot of business groups who have Haitian employees who are currently authorized to work as we're speaking, whom they're going to be required to lay off, and they find that very frustrating because they don't have people to fill those jobs. This particularly affects the healthcare industry. There's a lot of Haitians working in senior care facilities, working in hospitals, working in doctors' offices, and a lot of certified nursing assistants are fit into this category of Haitians who are currently lawfully authorized to work with temporary protected status, who are going to lose that status very shortly unless there's some sort of intervention. And that's not good for American citizens who depend upon someone being willing to do those jobs.
And I want to go back and highlight something you said. 50,000 children, U.S. citizens, natural born, whose parents have TPS, temporary protected status. What's going to happen to those children if the parents get deported back to Haiti?
That's the big question that no one can give you a good answer for. I mean, we know with mass deportation policies in general, so much broader than just Haitians, the best estimate that we came up with this working with the National Association of Evangelicals in a report called Joined Together, Torn Apart, there's probably about 910,000 U.S. citizen minor children who are likely to have at least one parent deported if the administration pursues its stated goals for deportation policies of 1 million deportations a year. In some of those cases, it'll be a temporary separation because once the parent is deported, the U.S. citizen child could probably get permission to go travel to their parents' country of origin and live with them there. That's much more difficult in Haiti because, again, if you're going to take the word of the U.S. State Department, you can go onto the travel advisory section of the U.S. State Department website and look up what they say about Haiti. There's a whole long list of terrible things happening in Haiti that are why the State Department categorizes the whole country as being in a state of emergency and advises U.S. citizens not to travel to Haiti under any circumstance. So if you're in that child, you're being advised not to travel to Haiti. In fact, there are no commercial flights flying into Port-au-Prince because the FAA says it's too dangerous for an American pilot to land a plane there without the risk of being harmed. And yet their parents, who again, in most cases entered lawfully, in all cases have been present lawfully for a number of years now. Many of them actually going back to 2010 with the earthquake hit Haiti. That was the initial reason to grant TPS for Haitians. So these are people who are quite well integrated into our communities. You're in this impossible situation. Mom and potentially dad or both have to go to Haiti. Children are staying here. Maybe they're going to live with extended family members. I do know that there are Haitian churches that are very actively preparing for how to take care of other people's children. There are other churches stepping into that as well. But also you will see some of these kids end up in the foster care system. You will see families. I've talked to Haitians who their best strategy, and I don't know that this is actually a strategy, but is, well, maybe we can all go to Canada. Well, that presumes that Canada will take you, which is not necessarily going to be the case. But you have families in a very desperate situation, and we just know, this is something that evangelical Christians have been saying since at least my childhood in the 1980s, that families are really important. It's best for a kid whenever possible, and we know there's some circumstances where this is not possible, for a child to grow up nurtured by a loving mother and father. And when you have a family situation like that, we don't want the government to interfere with that, except for in the rarest of situations where it's in the public safety interest of a child. And yet, with this situation with Haiti, our government is creating that situation. It's a completely preventable crisis. You could just let these people keep working, providing for themselves, paying their own rent, providing for their children. But we're poised to see that terminated in the coming days. And that doesn't mean everyone will be deported immediately. It takes a little time for the government to enact these policies, but we do anticipate we will see people detained and deported, and the impacts over the next year or two will be very profound, particularly for these children.
So basically what we're talking about here is, as a parent, you're faced with this choice of bringing your children with you to a nation that's very unsafe, insecure, or leaving your children to a safer place, but you have to leave them. You're their parent, and you have to leave them behind. What an impossible choice if you're a parent faced with that situation.
Yeah, it's an impossible choice, and one that our government is creating for reasons that I really have a hard time fathoming.
Yeah, and as you mentioned, this sort of, as an evangelical myself, the teaching, focus on the family. Every evangelical gets that reference. So where's the family in the policy? Where's the focus on the family in this policy when it comes to those 50,000 children?
Yeah.
Matthew Sorens, thank you so much for joining us. So here, the book is Seeking Refuge. I think this would be a great resource, especially if you're in a small group or something like that. Tell us a little bit about your co-authors, too, so we can give them due credit.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Stephen Bowman was our president at World Relief for a number of years and is still a very good friend of World Relief and a good friend of mine. He and his wife live in Michigan. And he served with World Relief in Rwanda before kind of taking leadership in the United States. So he's got a great perspective on sort of that global side of the refugee crisis. And then Isam Smear is actually here in the Chicagoland area. He's been at World Relief longer than I have, which I've been around 20 years. So he's been around a really long time. He's a psychologist. He's actually originally from Jordan. Grew up in a small town that happens to be right alongside one of the largest Syrian refugee camps, especially in the height of the Syrian refugee crisis. And he's worked here in the U.S. for World Relief, providing mental health support for refugees and other vulnerable immigrants for many years, and still is very connected back to the Middle East as well, and working with churches and others in the Middle East context. He's sort of our expert on trauma, which unfortunately is a part of the conversation when you talk about refugees. These are people who by definition have experienced things like torture and persecution. And they've gone through a lot, but also the good news, and Isam does a great job of writing on this, is that God made human beings to be remarkably resilient, and we see people find healing even after having gone through really horrific suffering.
All right, I'll put a link to the book in the description on our Substack. Matthew Sorens, thanks so much for joining us.
Yeah, thank you, Nap. I appreciate it.